I spent 16 years building something that was never going to be mine. I didn't find that out in a boardroom. I didn't find it out in a lawyer's office. I found it out at a Sunday dinner table, with a plate of pot roast in front of me and my father's hands folded on the tablecloth like he was about to say grace. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you've already decided the conversation is over before it begins. And he said, very quietly, as if the words weighed nothing at all, "We've decided the business goes to Marcus." Marcus was 28. Marcus had been working at Weston Hardware for 3 years. Marcus had never read a balance sheet in his life. I had been working there since I was 21. I had rebuilt the inventory system, renegotiated every supplier contract, opened 2 additional locations, and turned a business that was hemorrhaging money in 2011 into one generating $4.2 million in annual revenue by the time my father sat down at that table and handed it to my brother over pot roast. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I set my fork down very carefully on the rim of my plate and I said, "I see." And my mother nodded like that was the right answer. What happened in the 3 months after that dinner cost my family something they will never fully get back. And the thing that started it all was a letter, handwritten, 7 pages, tucked inside a manila envelope that had been sitting in my grandfather's attorney's file cabinet for 2 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to arrive. Welcome to Silent Drama Stories, the channel where the quietest people in the room turn out to have been keeping score the whole time. If you've ever been the one who did the work while someone else got the title, this one is going to sit with you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever built something that someone else got to put their name on? And make sure you subscribe, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Let me tell you who I was before that dinner, because it matters. It explains everything. I grew up in Millhaven, Ohio, a town small enough that everybody knew the Weston family and large enough that the Weston hardware store on Birch Street was a genuine institution. My grandfather, Edmund Weston, Grandpa Ede to everyone who knew him, had opened it in 1971 with $8,000 in savings and a handshake loan from his brother-in-law. By the time I was a child running between the lumber aisles on Saturday mornings, it was the kind of place people drove 40 minutes to visit because Edmund Weston stocked things nobody else thought to carry and knew the name of every customer who walked through the door. My father, Robert, took over operations in 1998 when Edmund's knees gave out and his doctor told him the warehouse floor was no longer an option. Dad was a decent manager, not a visionary, not a strategist, but steady. He kept the lights on. He kept the relationships. He had the name on the door and a handshake that people trusted, and for a while that was enough. Marcus came along in 1996, 7 years after me. He was the kind of boy who could charm anyone in 30 seconds and forget a promise in 31. My parents did not mean to raise him that way. It just happened the way certain things happen in families, gradually, incrementally, one small exception at a time, until the exception becomes the rule and nobody can remember when it changed. Marcus got the benefit of the doubt so many times that doubt stopped occurring to anyone when he was in the room. I was a different kind of child. Quiet, precise. I read the financial pages of the newspaper at 14 because I liked the way the numbers told stories without needing to be dramatic about it. My mother called me her little accountant and meant it as a compliment, but there was something in her voice when she said it that kept it from being warm. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studied business administration, and graduated in the top 8% of my class. The plan I had built quietly and carefully since I was about 15, was to come back to Millhaven and do for Weston Hardware what nobody had yet been willing to do. Modernize it, scale it, protect it for the next generation. I believed, with the absolute certainty of a 21-year-old who has never yet been seriously disappointed by the people she loves, that my family would want that. I started in June of 2009, right after graduation. I took a salary 30% below what I'd been offered at a Columbus firm because I told myself the equity would make up for it eventually. My father never put anything about equity in writing, which I would not fully reckon with for another decade. The first thing I did was pull every financial record we had going back 5 years and build a picture of where the business actually stood. What I found was not catastrophic, but it was not good. Margins were eroding on hardware because the big box stores had arrived in the county. Our inventory system was a combination of a 1990s software package and handwritten ledgers my grandfather had kept in his precise architect's script. We were overstocked in categories that weren't moving and understocked in the ones that were, and nobody had noticed because nobody had looked at the data as a whole. I spent that entire first year restructuring. I built a new inventory model. I renegotiated with 4 of our 6 primary suppliers, getting better terms by demonstrating order volume projections I had calculated to be realistic and then made happen. I killed the categories that were dead weight and doubled down on the ones where we had an actual competitive advantage over the big boxes. Specialty items, custom orders, contractor accounts, the kind of service that a warehouse store cannot replicate because it requires actual human knowledge. My father watched all of this with something between admiration and unease. He would praise my work in private and say nothing specific in front of my mother or his friends. My mother watched it with something I could not quite name then and can name clearly now, discomfort. Not with the results, with me specifically, with what it meant that I was the one producing them. By 2013, the business had turned a corner. Revenue was up, margins had stabilized, and we had signed 2 major contractor accounts that brought in recurring monthly volume. I proposed opening a second location, 20 miles up the highway, in a town that had lost its only independent hardware store to a fire 2 years earlier. My father was nervous. I built him a financial model so thorough and so conservative in its projections that he couldn't find a reason to say no. The second location opened in March of 2014. It was profitable within 18 months. I was 26 years old, and I had never once asked my father what was going to happen to the business when he retired. I should have asked. I know that now, but I had convinced myself that the answer was self-evident. I was there every day. I was the one who knew every supplier relationship, every contractor account, every lease agreement and vendor contract and bank covenant. The business ran because I ran it. I had assumed, with the kind of dangerous assumption that comes from being too competent for your own good, that the people who loved me could see that as clearly as I could. Marcus started working at the store in 2018. He was 22 and had just finished 2 years at a community college with a general studies associate degree and a social life that had clearly been the priority. My father gave him a floor manager title at the Birch Street location, which was the original store, the flagship, the one with my grandfather's name above the door. I did not object, at least not in a way that anyone heard. I told myself Marcus deserved a chance to find his footing in the business. That was true. I told myself he would grow into it if given the right support. That was possibly true. What I did not tell myself, because I was not yet ready to look at it directly, was that the way my father's voice changed when he talked about Marcus in the business, the specific warmth, the specific pride, told me something I wasn't ready to hear. Marcus was charming on the floor. Customers liked him. He had our grandfather's gift for conversation and our father's handshake, and the kind of ease with strangers that I had never quite possessed. He was genuinely good with people in the immediate, transactional sense. He remembered names, he made people laugh, he created the impression of generosity without any of the underlying work. What he could not do, and what became clear to me within about 6 months, was anything structural. He could not manage inventory reliably. He lost track of contractor commitments. He double-booked suppliers twice in 1 quarter. He approved a return policy exception that cost us a vendor relationship that had taken me 4 years to build. I fixed every one of these things quietly, the way I fixed everything. I absorbed the problems. I corrected the records. I made the calls. I had been doing that my entire career at Weston Hardware, and I was very, very good at it, which meant that from the outside, from my father's vantage point, everything always looked fine. It always looked fine because I made it look fine. This is the particular tax that competent people pay when they work inside a family. Your excellence becomes invisible because it eliminates the evidence of what would happen without it. 3 years of this. 3 years of Marcus on the floor and me in the back, and then came the Sunday dinner in October of 2021. I need to be precise about that dinner because the details matter. It was my parents' house, the same house I grew up in on Clement Street. My mother had made pot roast, which she makes when she wants the evening to feel settled and domestic, and like the kind of family we were in her preferred version of our story. Marcus was there with his girlfriend, Piper, who worked at the bank downtown and who I genuinely liked. I was there alone because I had been focused on work for the better part of a decade, and my personal life had paid the price in ways I had not fully acknowledged. My father cleared his throat after the second glass of wine. He did not look at me first. He looked at Marcus, and there was something in that look, a kind of permission, or maybe a shared understanding, that told me the conversation had happened before this one, in a room I had not been in. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said, "about the transition plan for the business." I set my fork down. I did not know I was doing it. My hands made the decision before my brain caught up. "We've decided that Marcus will take over as owner and operator when I step back. We're thinking spring of next year." He paused. "You'll stay on, of course. You're essential. We want you to stay on in your current capacity." My current capacity, after 16 years, after 2 locations, after $4.2 million in annual revenue, I would stay on in my current capacity. I looked at my brother. Marcus was looking at his plate with the specific stillness of a man who has been told to let someone else handle the hard conversation. Piper was looking at the wall slightly to the left of my head. My mother was watching my father with the expression she wears when she has already rehearsed this moment and is monitoring whether the performance is hitting its marks. "What does that mean, exactly?" I said. My voice was level. I was always level. It is one of the things people say about me and mean as a compliment, and I have come to understand is also a kind of isolation. "It means Marcus will have ownership and final authority," my father said. "You'd continue in your operational role. We'd look at a fair salary. You're part of this family, Clara. That doesn't change." "I am part of this family," I said, "and I have been running this business for 16 years. "You've been a tremendous help," my mother said, and the word help landed like a stone. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up my fork, finished my dinner, and said, "I'll need to think about this." And they nodded as if that was the end of it. As if I would think about it and arrive at acceptance the way I always arrived at the solution to every other problem they handed me. I drove home that night, and I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours without turning the lights on. What I felt was not rage, not yet. Rage came later in waves. What I felt that night was something closer to the specific clarity you get when a thing you have been half-knowing for a long time finally becomes undeniable. I had been funding a story about my family. The story was, we are a meritocracy, and the work you do will be recognized, and the business is your future too. The actual story, the one that had been running underneath for 20 years, was different. And I was done pretending I couldn't read it. I opened my laptop, and I did what I always do when I need to understand something clearly. I built a spreadsheet, not out of any plan for revenge, not yet. Just because I needed to see the numbers in one place, the way you need to see the full map before you can understand where you are. It took me 3 evenings. When I was done, what the spreadsheet showed was this. In 2009, Weston Hardware had annual revenues of approximately $1.1 million and was operating at a net margin of just under 4%. By 2021, revenues were $4.2 million across 3 locations, and net margin had improved to 11%. The 3rd location I had opened in 2019, in Carrington, was the highest margin operation of the 3. Over those 16 years, I had been paid a total of $812,000 in salary. That sounds like a reasonable number until you compare it to what a senior operations director with my track record and scope of responsibility would have commanded on the open market. When I ran that comparison, the number was closer to $1.4 million. The difference was $588,000. The discount I had accepted to work for my family, on the implicit understanding that there was equity in my future. There was no equity in my future. There never had been, and no one had ever said so out loud. I looked at those numbers for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and called the only person I knew would tell me the truth without managing my feelings about it. My grandfather, Edmund Weston, had been in a memory care facility in Millhaven since 2019, when his dementia had progressed to the point where living independently was no longer safe. He was 81 years old, and on his best days he knew who I was, and on his worst days he called me by his late wife's name, which was Margaret, and told me about things that had happened in 1967. I visited him every Sunday without fail, which is something else my family had quietly stopped doing as the visits became harder, and he became harder to reach. I did not call him that night, because you cannot call someone in memory care at 10 o'clock on a Sunday and expect a coherent conversation. But I went to see him the following Sunday, as I always did, and I sat with him in the common room that smelled of institutional coffee and artificial flowers, and I told him what my father had said. He was having a reasonably clear day. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, which was something he had never lost even as so much else eroded. He held my hand across the table, and he looked at me with his dark eyes that were still sharp in his weathered face, and he said, "Clara, I need you to talk to Arthur Beam." Arthur Beam was my grandfather's attorney. He had been his attorney for 30 years. I asked him why. He shook his head slowly, with the particular frustration of a man who knows what he wants to say and cannot find all the words in order. "There's a letter," he said. "I wrote it down because I knew I would forget. Arthur has it. Tell him Edmund sent you." He didn't say anything more about it that day. By the next week, he had no memory of the conversation, but I had written down the name. I want to stop here and tell you something about what happened at work in the weeks after that dinner, because it's important to understand who I was deciding to be. I went back to work on Monday morning, and I did my job. I did not sulk. I did not sabotage. I did not make a single move that could have been characterized as acting out. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the specific kind of person this story is about. The kind who has been so thoroughly trained to absorb and perform and deliver that even in the moment of their deepest betrayal, the first instinct is still to protect the institution. I processed 3 supplier invoices, resolved a discrepancy in the Carrington location's inventory count, and had a 30-minute call with our bank about the line of credit renewal. I did all of this because the business needed it done, and because, whatever was happening in my family, I was not going to let the business suffer for it. That would have been punishing myself. But I was also, very quietly, doing something else. I was documenting. Not aggressively, not with any specific plan in mind, but I began keeping a careful written record of my decisions and their outcomes. Every supplier negotiation, every operational call I made, every time I identified a problem and solved it. I had been doing the work for 16 years without a paper trail that had my name on it. That was going to change. Marcus, to his credit, was not triumphant about the announcement. He was awkward around me in the weeks after the dinner in the way that people are awkward when they have gotten something they know they did not fully earn. He tried to have a conversation with me about it once, in the stockroom at the Birch Street location, and what he said was, "This wasn't my idea, Clara. I want you to know that." I believed him, actually. It wasn't his idea. Marcus was not the architect of this. He was the beneficiary, which is a different thing and a somewhat more forgivable one, but ultimately not my problem to manage. "What are you going to do?" he asked me. "My job," I said, and I went back to the office. I called Arthur Beam the following week. Arthur Beam was 73, a small, precise man with an office above the old pharmacy on Main Street that smelled of pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in 15 years. He had known my grandfather since they were both young men, and he had the careful, measured way of speaking that comes from decades of delivering news that people are not prepared for. He did not seem surprised to hear from me. "Your grandfather told me you might call," he said, which stopped me. "When?" "About 2 years ago, when he still had the capacity to direct me clearly. He was having a good day. He asked me to hold something for you and to give it to you when you came asking, or when he passed, whichever came first." He reached into the file cabinet behind his desk, the deep lower drawer that attorneys keep for things that need to be kept a long time, and he produced a manila envelope that was sealed with tape, and had my name written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. Precise, architectural, the hand of a man who had spent his life measuring things carefully. "Do you want to read it here or take it with you?" Arthur asked. I took it with me. I drove to the park by the reservoir where my grandfather used to take me to feed the ducks when I was small, and I sat on the bench nearest the water, and I opened it. 7 pages, handwritten. Dated March of 2019, 2 months before he moved into the memory care facility. He had known what was coming. He had written this while he still could. I am not going to read you every word, because some of it was private, the kind of thing a grandfather writes to a grandchild that belongs only to the two of them. But I am going to tell you what it contained, because it is the thing that changed everything. The first 3 pages were about the business, about its history, about what it had meant to him to build it, about what he had watched me do to it in the years since I came home. He named specific things: the supplier renegotiations, the second location, the contractor accounts, the inventory rebuild. He had been paying attention in a way that nobody had told me. He wrote, "Clara, you did not help build this business. You rebuilt it. There is a difference, and I want you to know that I know the difference." The 4th page was harder. He wrote about my father carefully, with love, but with a clarity that told me he had thought about this for a long time. "Your father is a good man," he wrote, "but he has a particular blindness when it comes to his son, and I suspect you know what I mean. I have watched it your whole lives, and I did not address it as firmly as I should have, and I am sorry for that. I am writing this now because I will not be able to say it later, and because someone needs to say it while it can still do some good." The 5th and 6th pages were instructions. Detailed, specific, the kind of instructions that a man writes when he has spent his life in business and knows exactly what he means to leave behind. Edmund Weston had, over the course of his retirement, quietly and without ever discussing it with my father, accumulated a set of assets separate from the business. A piece of commercial real estate in Millhaven that the hardware store had leased since 2004. A second property in Carrington, which was the location I had opened in 2019. The hardware store did not own its buildings. It leased them. It had always leased them. And both of those buildings belonged to my grandfather, held in a trust I had not known existed. The trust, Arthur Beam had told me before I read the letter, was valid and had been established with the kind of care that made it difficult to contest. It had been drawn up by Arthur himself, reviewed by a second attorney in Columbus, and notarized in the presence of witnesses during a period when my grandfather had been assessed as having full legal capacity. Arthur was quite specific about this. The buildings had been left to me. Not the business. The business was my father's to do with as he chose. But the land and buildings that the business operated from, the flagship store on Birch Street, the store in Carrington, those were mine. And the leases on those properties were coming up for renewal. The 7th page was brief. It said, "I am not leaving you a weapon, Clara. I am leaving you a position. What you do with it is your choice, and I trust your judgment more than I have ever trusted anyone else's in matters of business. Use it the way you would use any other piece of information, carefully, honestly, and only after you have decided what outcome you actually want. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that the best parts of this business have your hands on them. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. All my love. Grandpa Ede." I sat by the reservoir for a long time. The ducks moved across the water in the afternoon light, and I held 7 pages of my grandfather's handwriting, and I let myself understand what he had done. He had not done it out of spite. He had done it out of the same careful, structural thinking that had built the business in the first place. He had seen what I had not fully let myself see, that the business I had rebuilt would not protect me, and so he had made sure that something else would. I drove home and I called Arthur Beam and I asked him one question. "When do the leases renew?" "March," he said, "both of them." It was November. I need to tell you what I did not do in the weeks after reading that letter, because it is as important as what I did. I did not call my father. I did not confront my mother. I did not tell Marcus. I went to work every day and I did my job with the same precision I had always brought to it, and I said nothing, and I documented everything. There is a thing that happens when you are very good at being calm. People stop checking on you. They assume that your steadiness means you have accepted the situation because they confuse composure with consent. My family had been making that mistake my entire life. They made it again now. My father began the formal transition process in January. He hired a business attorney, not Arthur Beam, a different one, younger, from a firm in Columbus, to draw up the transfer of ownership documents. He sent me an email asking me to provide operational documentation that Marcus could use to understand how the business ran. I provided it. Every document he asked for, organized cleanly, labeled precisely. My name was on most of it in ways that were now more visible than they had ever been, because I had spent the previous 3 months making sure of that. In February, the attorney my father had hired reached out to Arthur Beam to arrange the lease renewals as part of the transition package. Arthur informed him that the leases would need to be negotiated directly with the new property owner, as the trust had transferred ownership of both buildings to a family member upon Edmund Weston's death. My grandfather had died quietly in his sleep in December. I had been with him on the Sunday before, sitting in the common room, reading to him from the newspaper the way I had done for the last 2 years of his life, even when he could no longer quite follow the words. My father did not know about the trust. My mother did not know. Marcus did not know. My grandfather had not told them, and Arthur Beam had not told them because my grandfather had not asked him to. The attorney called my father on a Tuesday morning in February, and I was not present for that conversation. But my father called me 40 minutes later, and his voice had the flat, careful quality that I recognized because I had inherited it. "Clara, I need to understand something. Arthur Beam's office is saying that the Birch Street building and the Carrington building were left to you." "That's correct," I said. A silence. "Your grandfather did that." "He did." Another silence, longer. "When were you going to tell me?" "I'm telling you now." I paused. "When were you going to tell me there was no equity in my future?" He did not answer that. The line was quiet for long enough that I had to check to see if we were still connected. Finally he said, "Clara, what do you want?" And that was the real question, the one everything else had been building toward. What did I want? I had spent 3 months with that question, turning it over the way my grandfather used to turn things over in his hands before he decided what to do with them. I had not wanted revenge. I had wanted to be seen. I had wanted 16 years of work to mean something concrete and permanent. I had wanted what my grandfather had apparently known I deserved from a distance that should have been closer to home. But I had also learned something from the letter. My grandfather had not left me a weapon. He had left me a position. And the difference between those two things was entirely in how I chose to use it. "I want to have a conversation," I said. "A real one. I want my family in a room, and I want the actual numbers on the table, and I want us to talk about what this business is and who built it and what a fair outcome actually looks like. I don't want to burn it down. I never wanted to burn it down. I want what is fair." He was quiet again. Then, "All right, Sunday." It was a different kind of Sunday dinner. My mother had made pot roast again, which I suspected was not an accident, some attempt to recreate the atmosphere of the October dinner and return to the terms of that one. But the atmosphere was not the same, because I was not the same person who had sat at that table in October and set her fork down carefully and said, "I see," as if I were being asked about the weather. My father was there, and my mother, and Marcus, and Piper, and Arthur Beam, whom I had asked to come because some things need a witness, and because Arthur had known my grandfather for 50 years and deserved to be in the room when Edmund Weston's final act was properly understood. Arthur brought the trust documents. I brought the spreadsheet. 2 pieces of paper that together told the whole story of Weston Hardware more honestly than anyone at that table had ever told it before. I did not make a speech. I am not a speech person. I set the spreadsheet in the center of the table the way I set any document in the center of a business meeting, calmly, with the expectation that people would look at it and allow it to mean what it meant. "This is what the business was in 2009, I said, pointing to the first column. "This is what it is now. These are my years of employment, my salary across that period, and this is what my equivalent compensation would have been on the open market. I let them look at it. I did not fill the silence. Numbers don't need help. My father looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. My mother looked at her plate. Then I put the trust documents beside the spreadsheet, Arthur's clean, unambiguous paperwork that showed in plain language what my grandfather had done and why. I don't want the business to fail, I said. I have never wanted that. What I want is a legitimate ownership stake that reflects what I have actually contributed, and I want that in writing, with legal weight, before any transition to Marcus happens. I want a formal valuation, I want my contribution recognized in equity, and I want a seat at the table, an actual seat, not a courtesy. Marcus raised his head. He looked, genuinely, like a man having a moment of clarity he had been avoiding. That's fair, he said. My mother made a sound. My father looked at her and then looked back at me. And if we don't agree, he said, not a threat, a real question. Then the leases come up for renewal in March, I said, and I will need to make decisions about the terms as the property owner. I would rather not make those decisions in an adversarial context. I'd rather make them as a co-owner of a business I helped build. Arthur cleared his throat gently. Edmund was very clear in his wishes, he said. He wanted this to be an opportunity for the family to get to a fair place. He did not intend it as a punishment. He intended it as a correction. My father looked at Arthur for a long time. He had known Arthur almost as long as my grandfather had. He understood, I think, in that moment, that Edmund Weston had thought about this very carefully and over a very long time, and that the man who had built Weston Hardware from nothing had made a considered judgment about what his business deserved and who it should belong to. Robert, Arthur said quietly, he loved you. This wasn't about that. He just also loved her. He nodded toward me, and he watched. My father's jaw worked. He looked at the spreadsheet again, at the numbers that were simply and only true, and I watched something in him shift, not dramatically, not with any kind of collapse, just the way a structure settles when the weight on it is finally correctly distributed. All right, he said, let's talk about what fair looks like. I am going to tell you how it settled, because I know that's what you're here for, and because the settling matters. It took 4 months. 4 months of meetings with attorneys, a formal business valuation conducted by an independent firm in Columbus, and a series of conversations that were sometimes difficult and sometimes unexpectedly honest and occasionally, briefly, resembled the family I had always hoped we were. The outcome was this. I received a 45% equity stake in Weston Hardware, documented and legally binding. Marcus received 40%. My father retained 15% until retirement, at which point his shares would be divided equally between Marcus and me. The lease on both properties was restructured at fair market value with a 10-year renewal, providing stability for the business and legitimate income from the properties I owned. My title changed. I became co-owner and chief operating officer, which was simply what had been true for 16 years finally put on paper where everyone could see it. Marcus, to his genuine credit, adapted. He was not graceless about it. He told me privately a few weeks after the agreements were signed that he had known for a long time that something was wrong about the original plan, that he had not had the language or the spine to say so, and that he was sorry. It was not a perfect apology, but it was a real one. I accepted it the way you accept an honest thing, carefully, without letting it mean more than it does, but also without throwing it away. My mother took longer. She still has not fully said what I think she needs to say, which is that she spent 20 years treating my steadiness as a convenience and my brother's charm as an achievement, and that the two of us deserved different from her. She has gotten better at being in the same room with me, which is progress of a kind, and I am not in the business of demanding performances of remorse from people who aren't ready to give them. I am in the business of watching what people do. My father said one thing to me about 6 weeks after that Sunday dinner that I have kept. He called me on a Tuesday morning, not about anything business-related, which was itself unusual. He said, "Your grandfather told me once, years ago, that the person who does the most quiet work in a room is usually the most important person in it." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. He stopped. I understand now. I said, "Thank you, Dad." And I meant it, and I let it be what it was, incomplete and imperfect and genuine, which is the most you can usually say about the important things people finally say. Here is the last thing I want to tell you, because it is the part of the story that lives in me most. On the day the ownership agreements were signed, I drove out to the cemetery where my grandfather is buried, at the edge of Millhaven where the fields start and the town stops. It was March, cold and bright, the kind of Ohio morning that is more light than warmth. I stood at his grave for a while with no particular agenda, the way you stand somewhere when you don't need to accomplish anything, you just need to be there. I had brought the signed agreement. I don't know exactly why. It seemed right to bring him something that was his in origin if not in form. The thing he had set in motion 2 years ago with a letter and a trust and a faith in me that I had not known I was carrying until it arrived. I had one more thing with me, the spreadsheet. 16 years of numbers, 12 clean rows, the full picture of what Weston Hardware had been and what it had become and who had done what to make it that way. My grandfather had taught me to read numbers when I was small. He had sat with me at his kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and shown me how to make a column of figures tell the truth about a situation, how to let the math be honest when the people around you were being vague. I looked at the spreadsheet and I thought about what he had written in the letter. The best parts of this business have your hands on them. I folded it once and tucked it into my coat pocket next to the signed agreement. Some documents you carry for a while before you put them away. Then I walked back to my car and drove to the Birch Street location, the flagship store, the one with Edmund Weston's name above the door, which had been there since 1971, and which would stay there as long as I had anything to say about it. I unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and went to work. If this story found you today, I want to ask you something honest. Are you the person in your family, in your workplace, in your life, who does the quiet work that holds everything together and has never once been formally recognized for it? Have you been funding someone else's story with your own time and labor and faith? Pull one statement tonight. Look at one number. Ask yourself what the full accounting actually shows and whether the people around you have been reading it honestly. The people who call you the steady one are sometimes simply nomming the person they have quietly decided they will never have to carry. You are allowed to let the numbers speak. You are allowed to take up the space you have already earned. And you are allowed to do it calmly, with paper in your hand and your grandfather's faith at your back, and let the truth be witnessed. That's my story. A business, a letter, and 16 years of work that finally had a name on it. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had someone in your corner the way my grandfather was in mine? Someone who saw you clearly when the people closest to you had decided not to look. Share this with the quiet one in your life who is carrying more than anyone knows. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.